How much do we know about the history of the Viltrum Empire, and everything that led to the modern age of the Viltrumite invasions? The most powerful empire in the galaxy did not simply come about overnight. It took eons of grueling work, heavy bloodshed to construct this glorious kingdom. And today, let's take a deep dive into the history of the Viltrum Empire, and dissect the history that made their empire truly Long before the days of conquest that define the empire today, they were governed under the rule of one monarch known as Argal. This was the golden age of peace, a far cry from the Viltrum that we now know from the Invincible series. Little is known about Argal's time in the throne of Viltrum though, as the histories and stories are mixed, some praising him as a glorious and a benevolent king, while others claim he was a conqueror in his own right, but no one is for sure certain. However, we do know that as history is told to us, it is common for aggressors to downplay their roles, so if some were to claim that Argal was a tyrant, while others echoed his songs of greatness and understated his violent tendencies. What's important about Argal, however, is that the Viltrumite Empire united under him, and whether they were conquerors or they were peaceful, they were one unified force. It was said that Argal's bloodline was so pure that he was among the strongest natural-born Viltrumites, and it was said that his heirs would be just as strong as him. That was, however, until the first of them turned. At some point during Argal's rule, the Viltrumite known as Thetus renounced the empire and became the first known traitor in Viltrum's history. Despite Viltrum's attempt to remove Thetus from their history books though, he remained. The fact that Thetus abandoned the empire is even more evidence that stories of peacetime were nothing more than propaganda peddled by the supporters of Argal, because Thetus saw something that made him abandon his entire heritage. We also know that even though Argal didn't have a publicly recognized heir, he did breed one particular soldier with some intent of being his equal. By his side was the Viltrumite known as Thragg, who was trained by the hand of the Emperor himself. By all accounts, Thragg is the strongest of the modern Viltrumites behind only Argal himself, and allegedly, his secret heir. He is so strong that even Conquest himself fears the might of Thragg, and Conquest is one that Viltrum sends out to particularly problematic worlds, as he is regarded to be the strongest among them, but more on this in just a minute. Not only did this lead to Thetus' betrayal of the Empire, but Thetus was the one to assassinate the Emperor, which began a downward spiral of disaster after disaster for the entirety of the Empire. Thetus retreated into the deepest corners of the universe, and eventually, he founded the organization known as the Coalition of Planets, in order to preside as a governing council for multiple voices of multiple peoples. Viltrum, however, was thrust into disarray and war, but whispers of Argal's secret heir were making the rounds, and as many Viltrumites had heard the rumors that Argal was not the end of his bloodline, and so the search began for the heir to the throne of Viltrum. This is what kicked off the Viltrumite Civil War, because the Empire was searching far and wide for an emperor, and all of them knew that Argal's heir would be the strongest among them. When Nolan talks about how Viltrum purged the weak from their society, he wasn't lying. He was just not letting us know the full story about why they were fighting, and it was because they knew whoever would lead them next would not be among the casualties. As a warrior people, however, the Viltrumites took things way too far, and eventually, enough was enough. They ended the bloodshed with the numbers that they had left, but those who survived were the very best of the best. The greatest fighters not only of the Viltrumites, but in the entire universe. As the right-hand man to the previous emperor, Thragg was named Grand Regent, but his mission remained the same, and that was to track down the heir to Argal and place him as the true bloodline on the true throne of Viltrum. This is why he did not take the title of emperor. He kept Argal's skull though as a reminder of the dark days, and every time Viltrum falls into disarray, he is reminded of what could happen if the Ascension continues to not go addressed in the Empire. Thragg ruled the Empire as a strong, respected survivor and a warrior of the Viltrumite Civil War, and for centuries on end, this was Viltrumite's Silver Age. They conquered every world in sight, sending legions of warriors to rip a planet's defenses apart, to shreds. There was simply nothing that any lone world could do against the combined might of multiple united Viltrumites, but multiple worlds together, well, that's a different story. This wave of conquest led multiple planets into the arms of the Coalition, which was amassing more and more power with each member in each world that joined their cause. The Coalition was designed to safeguard the universe, but each planet that joined made donations in the realm of science, technology, and information, making them a legitimate threat. They pulled everything they knew into one grand archive, where scientists from various worlds would collaborate, and the planets themselves would share intel and resources with one another. Where one world suffered, another would lend a hand under the expectation that the rules would be inevitably reversed someday, and the same would be true the other way around. Viltrum, however, was a united front, and they still had the manpower to subjugate any world of their choosing. and despite the best combined efforts of the coalition, there was still not a clear way to beat the Viltrumites in single combat. They could be strategically outmaneuvered, and many planets in the coalition could provide more advanced technology, but as far as killing and beating a Viltrumite, a solution had not presented itself. So far, the most destruction that anyone had ever done to Viltrum came by Viltrum's own hand. But Thetus had a plan. He saw the destruction that Viltrum was causing, so he used a sample of his own DNA to engineer a virus that would directly target Viltrumites. This pathogen soon became known as the Scourge virus. The Scourge virus absolutely decimated the remaining Viltrumite population, and in the comics, it is confirmed that it left 99.9% of the population dead, and those that were lucky enough to survive were severely weakened, their powers diminished. They were susceptible to harm that they had never experienced before, and this is where many of them died, since they simply did not understand how dangerous the galaxy was. The Viltrumites who were dealing with the weakened effects were overconfident in their abilities still, and many of them had no idea how to actually handle a situation that proved to be a significant threat. When all was said and done though, there were fewer than 50 pure-blooded Viltrumites left in the entire universe, but the Empire could not afford to look weak in the face of their new handicap. The fact still remained that they did not have the manpower to keep conquering worlds though with the same speed and ferocity that they once did. But the galaxy could not become aware of this. If their expansion slowed or stopped, then someone would eventually realize that something was severely wrong and the Viltrumite Empire would be vulnerable. So they needed an approach that made it clear to the galaxy that they were still a force to be reckoned with. This is the part of the truth that Nolan omitted when he was telling Mark the story of the Viltrumite Empire, because he led Mark to believe that the Viltrumite Civil War was the reason why the tactics had changed, when in actuality, this was not true. So they began sending just one Viltrumite to each new world. However, it was critical that the worlds in question did not know who the Viltrumites were, otherwise they would require a much stronger approach. By assimilating themselves into the cultures and societies of different planets though, they gained their trust, shared their knowledge, their technology, and eventually, some worlds even surrendered themselves to the Viltrumite Empire willingly, not knowing that the promise of prosperity was built upon a lie and blood. They just witnessed the wonders of science and security that the Viltrumite Empire could offer them, but they did not realize that these advancements were built on the backs of slave worlds. Planets under the Empire would be drafted, and so many innocents who just wanted security for their worlds ended up working in labor camps, or in worse cases, they were drafted to be the security force for another planet's labor camp. The Viltrumite Empire turned worlds against others. They caused entire wars that they would never directly get involved in. This is how Viltrum built such a vast army under the command of their forces. Their army is not from Viltrum, and if they knew just how weak the Empire was, it is likely that they would be susceptible to turn. But they were too afraid of what the Viltrumites could do if they ever rebelled. If just one could subjugate an entire planet, then what could an entire battalion of them do? Yes, in a technical sense, these planets received security from the Empire, but the life the Empire was protecting was no longer a life that was worth living. Viltrum had complete access to whatever they wanted, and some worlds were able to see through the lies before the Viltrumite Empire ever arrived though, and they stood their ground. This is when a Viltrumite's job changes. They are tasked with weakening the defenses of the planet from the inside out, making them vulnerable to subjugation. This is why Omni-Man killed the original roster of the Guardians. He did this not just because they were physical threats though, but because their loss would make the Earth afraid, and when the Earth was afraid, they looked up to him. But even more important than this, they listened. This act was just as much a political and a psychological maneuver as it was a militaristic one. We've seen up close what happens to a world when they resist Viltrumite control, and the ramifications are forceful subjugation. Even when their numbers are down in the double digits, Viltrumites are still incredibly formidable, and as we stated in the very beginning, their empire was not built overnight. It took centuries of conflict and a brush with extinction itself to become as strong as they are now, and time will only tell what the show has in store for us. But anyway guys, what do you think of the history of the Viltrum Empire, and which parts would you like to see adapted into the Invincible series? As always my friends, smash that subscribe button for more comic lore, and I hope that you're having an absolutely great day.